Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mayra Buvinic, and I am a Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Center for Global Development. And I am just delighted today to have a chat, a conversation with Ratna Sahay from the IMF and Hana Brixi from the World Bank. Ratna has recently joined in a new position at the IMF as Senior Advisor on Gender on the Office of the Managing Director. And it's a really new position, and we're so excited. And congratulations, Ratna, for your appointment. And Hana is also sort of newly the new Global Director for Gender at the World Bank. So congratulations to you, Hana. And I am delighted to have you both. So we're going to have an informal conversation, but for the audience, you can ask questions. Also, I will be asking a lot of questions, but we will have some time for you too. And you can ask questions by commenting on the comment bubble on YouTube, by tweeting at CGDDev, or by emailing at events@cgdev.org. So with that, without further ado, I will start. And Hana and Ratna, you're both new to your respective roles. Coming into your new positions, what are the key opportunities you perceive to ensure each of your organizations contribute to the promotion of global gender equality, and what are the biggest challenges you anticipate? Ratna, all yours.
Thank you so much, Mayra. I am so excited to be here with you and Hana to have this conversation. Today is a really auspicious day in another way. It's one of our biggest festivals called Diwali, the Festival of Lights. So I would like to wish you and Hana and all our listeners what we call health, wealth, and happiness. So greetings to all of you. Indeed, it's an opportune time for the IMF to step up its work on gender, no less because gender disparities are large globally, but also because the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women. And you know, there's really an increasing realization at the IMF and also elsewhere that persistent gender disparities can have large macroeconomic consequences, and that closing gender gaps benefits not just women, but society as a whole. So that's really important to keep in mind. Our vision at the IMF is ambitious, but it's simple. It is to apply a gender lens to all aspects of our core activities, which are three: the annual consultations we have with our member countries, our lending programs, and capacity development. Now, because it's ambitious and it's so encompassing, I can tell you it's going to take time, but we are confident we will get there. What we would really like to do is to provide country-specific and granular policy advice to countries where gender disparity is deemed what we call macro-critical. So what do we mean by macro-critical? We mean that gender disparities have macroeconomic consequences, and macro or financial policies can impact men and women differently. So we need to be mindful that at the very least, fund policy recommendations do not worsen gender disparity. Instead, they proactively help close them. So we see two distinct opportunities for the IMF. First, the IMF's work, we hope and plan to fill a gap that currently exists among IFIs and multilateral development banks. And that is to focus on macroeconomic and financial policies and the macro consequences of gender disparities. In that regard, we would complement the extensive work already being done by others, definitely the World Bank, UN Women, IFC, EBRD, regional development banks. There is so much out there. And as a latecomer to this field, we are very keen to learn from other institutions and eager to establish collaboration opportunities. And we do that very much with Hana, and we can talk about that later. A second opportunity, which is something that our partners are also very excited about, is that the IMF's main interlocutors are ministers of finance and central bank governors. These are people who control the purse strings and lead economic policy. Having the year of, say, a finance minister means that we can directly discuss how gender inequality may impede growth or hurt financial stability, and what we can do and how we can design policies and programs to reduce gender gaps. But as you rightly point out, there are many challenges. And very briefly, they include, and I'll be honest, getting buy-in from authorities, changing the way we ourselves think inside the IMF, accessing gender disaggregated data, and building the right models so we can provide quality impacts. Thank you, Mayra.
Thank you. That's music to my ears, and I think many people's ears, because that gender inequality is macro critical. I think is something that the field of gender and development has been talking about since the very beginning. I mean, and I go back to Esther Boserup and the negative impact of development on women. And, but until recently, I mean, there was little movement, and you clearly are the right institution for doing that. So it is terrific. And I think, it will really advance the field forward and advance the well-being of women, for certainly if we focus on the macroeconomic linkages to gender inequality and equality. Hana, I'll turn it to you. And the bank also talks about macro, and they like to talk about macro, but also micro. So tell us sort of from your perspective, what are the big challenges and opportunities at the bank?
Thank you so much, Mayra, for having me. And it's wonderful to share the stage together with Ratna. Happy Diwali, Ratna.
Thank you.
And to all listeners. So as you know, Mayra and Ratna and listeners may know that the World Bank Group has been very much involved in promoting gender equality and has put it at the center of its assistance toward economic development in countries. And this has been especially strong since the World Development Report on Gender Equality and Development, which made a very strong case based on economics, based on evidence, that promoting gender equality is important in its own right as a development objective, and it is also smart economics. And I can talk more about the 10-year retrospective, how far we have gone in terms of leveraging World Bank Group's activities to make progress in closing gender gaps. Now, let me respond to your question, Mayra, perhaps focusing more on the current situation. So currently, what are the opportunities and challenges? And I would highlight 3 opportunities. One is an opportunity to build on a very strong momentum that we have largely thanks to a growing evidence and data and knowledge on the critical importance of closing gender gaps, and also how to do it, what solutions work. And this evidence is now translating into more effective policy dialogue with the ministries of finance as well as sector ministries, and more effective operations. So the opportunity is to build on this momentum further. So that's one. Second is an opportunity now to prioritize gender equality and women's empowerment in the efforts to develop a strong, resilient, and sustainable recovery after the pandemic. We all know that the pandemic had a devastating impact on especially on women and adolescent girls. We know that the pandemic crisis has exposed huge economic and social cost of the existing gender gaps. And the pandemic, however, the response to the pandemic has also highlighted opportunities on how to advance financial and digital inclusion, care services, and other important areas that are for gender equality. And the third opportunity I would see now is in the context of the World Bank Group's green, resilient, and inclusive development approach. We now have an opportunity to position women as agents of change and to prioritize investments and policy actions that would provide women with the choices, with the capacities, with the opportunities to engage as part of the green transition and in fact to drive the green transition. Now, in terms of challenges, I would see the main challenge being at this point of time, perhaps less on the why, less on the advocacy. Of course, it's still important to have the evidence and make the specific cases on why promoting gender equality or closing specific gender gaps or making specific investments in girls' and women's empowerment is important. But the challenge is really on the how, the solutions that work. And the challenge is to bring the evidence, adapting global knowledge to specific country context, piloting and testing interventions that could work in specific local contexts. So that's, and I should not forget, very importantly, engaging civil society in the efforts so that there is evidence on what works, how it works, and that also the changes are accepted and promoted by the society. So let me stop here and back to you.
Great, and you raised a lot of questions that now I want to talk about civil society, but I also want to talk, about the pandemic. And the pandemic clearly, as you say, and I think it's clear that it has had a disproportionate effect on women and gender inequality. It has had also economically a disproportionate effect on poor countries. While, and I think that the IMF, some of the IMF figures is just shocking that while, rich countries have spent about 20% of GDP on combating or providing assistance to the pandemic, low-income countries, very low, like 2%. So, and that I think has sort of called for the bank and the fund to spend more, to transfer resources to developing countries. And there are all these conversations. So I would like maybe first to start about that. And the big concern, I think, outside of these institutions is, well, maybe all these institutions now, they're going to be new infusions of funds going to poor countries, to developing countries, concessional funding perhaps. How do we ensure that funding, and Ratna, we start with you. I think, I was just hearing Kristalina the other day saying, a main objective of the fund is to trigger a fairer growth, to trigger basically growth with equality. So how can we ensure that some of the resources that the fund is going to be sort of giving liquidity to developing countries, particularly to the poor countries, are used to promote gender equality? And perhaps also, Ratna, if you can talk a bit about sort of this conversation now of the special drawing rights of the SDRs, and that those would be a channel of funding. So I start with you, and then we go to Hana.
Thanks very much, Mayra. As Hana was talking, it also reminded me that I should have mentioned one more thing on your previous question. We are, fund management and the board are highlighting new emerging priorities, and gender and inclusion is, of course, one of them. But the other three are actually on climate, digital money, and fragile states. And each of these areas have a big gender component. So we're also excited because there'll be opportunities through these other new priorities to focus on gender. But let me get back to your question, very valid question. And indeed, we have focused a lot, as you know, on how to help our member countries during the pandemic. And we are still continuing to do that through various ways. We have extended a number of concessional loans already, very quickly in the initial phase. And now, with greater allocation of SDRs, it is giving us another opportunity. So let me try and explain how we can do it.
Can you tell us what SDRs are also?
Okay, so SDRs are special. They're called special drawing rights, and these have right from when the fund started, these were allocated to different member countries for their use. And also for lending purposes. We lend everything in SDRs and then we make them equivalent to dollars. And these there's a particular formula according to which these are allocated to countries, which include, the size of the economy, the population, GDP, etc., the share of trade in global economy. So there are many components to it. So as you know well, unlike in the UN, the shares of different member countries are indeed different. So if the amount of SDRs increase, it gives each of the member countries more access to borrow and lend in SDRs. So coming back to the SDRs, indeed, what we are advising our member countries is on how best to use the SDRs in an appropriate, transparent, accountable manner. And this advice on the use of SDRs is guided by a set of principles which has been laid out in the guidance note for Fund 4, which is actually available on our external website. So what can we do with these SDRs? So the member countries have actually quite a bit of freedom on how to manage the SDRs. In determining how to use them, several macroeconomic policy considerations need to be taken into account. For example, how are they mitigating the COVID pandemic and its economic impact? How much monetary and fiscal space do they have? And there are other country-specific factors such as poverty, inequality, inclusion also come into play. But we are also saying that SDRs, the use of this should not be substituting for macroeconomic reforms that are needed, nor should it substitute away other concessional sources of financing that they get. The whole idea of the SDR financing, it is for reforms, but it is to cover an initial gap until more permanent revenue sources are realized. So in many countries, as you rightly point out, the most urgent policy priority is to control the pandemic and accelerate the recovery. So this includes protecting the most vulnerable and ensuring that they benefit from the recovery. And as Hana just pointed out, the pandemic has had a very severe consequence on women, but also on the low-skilled informal sectors, youth. And what the SDRs can do is to create policy space to implement such policies that support these vulnerable groups, which of course includes women, and they will help them preserve or restore employment, other types of care, and therefore also limit the scarring that has already happened. Now, once the countries exit the emergency phase of the COVID-19, they need to go from crisis support to policies that rebuild macro buffers and facilitate resource reallocation. Here, the inclusive policies that give greater opportunities to women and reduce gender inequality can play a critical role. Again, SDRs may allow for greater policy space, say through larger fiscal deficits or greater use of external reserves. But in the end, these fiscal policies should be set in the context of a medium-term fiscal framework. And our real concern is, of course, to ensure debt sustainability and also the credibility of these countries. So finally, let me also emphasize that it's really important to promote high quality spending and transparency and good governance. And here again, we encourage our authorities to follow the IMF's Fiscal Transparency Code in the use of SDRs in public finances. So let me stop there, Mayra. Thank you.
So thank you. So just before we go to Hannah, I just wanted to sort of ask you, and let me see if I understand. Well, you're saying that basically beyond the SDRs will sort of provide you some fiscal space, but the important thing is the longer term recovery policies, and to, you know, that the macro policies be right, and that they be inclusive, and that they lead to a better, more fairer economy. But how do you, I mean, in order to check that that is happening, you need data, right? How do you go about checking? And that's the bigger next concern is, do we have the right data to check this?
I think that's an excellent question, Mayra. I mean, you know, in what you described as an inclusive, fairer recovery, let me also add the word sustainable. It's really important to have sustainability, and that's where, you know, appropriate macro framework and with the mind, keeping in mind the idea that it's really important to give these countries fiscal room at this point in time, but over time they really need to get back into sustainability, and it can take longer. That's not an issue, but the context has to be there, the benchmarks have to be there, and the targets have to be there. You're asking a really tough question on the data side. You know, we've there is, you know, okay, so let me say that there is quite a bit of data out there, but they may be in many different places. Sometimes we've even found that if we talk to the Ministry of Finance, they may not even sometimes be aware of data on girls and women that exists. So I think many countries are making a lot of effort in getting the data together. And there are some really important sources that already exist, of course, which includes the Findex, which you know well. We also have the Financial Access Survey of the IMF. There are data gaps, no question. We also have problems sometimes in getting the authorities to kind of submit the data, which might or might not exist. And I will say it's not just related to developing countries. It's an issue we've had also with advanced countries. So it's a message to all member countries to submit data. So one is this issue of, you know, do we have the right data, the right variables? But it's also a question of how frequently can we get the data? And there again, I think there is a lot of scope to push ahead on the data side. And in the IMF, we are trying to do our part. As I already mentioned to you, we have the statistics department, which is doing a tremendous job on the financial access survey data, where now they have data which is gender disaggregated. I cannot claim that it's fully comprehensive yet, but increasingly more and more countries are actually providing data. Then we, and just to give you an example, because we do it annually, you know, the latest data that we just published, it showed that the number of female borrowers per 1,000 female adults had fallen in many economies during the COVID. So this is really something which is timely, because then we can, the authorities can take action because they got this data on a timely basis. But it's very discouraging to get this kind of information. Another thing our statistics department is doing is it's working on building comprehensive databases and tools focused very much on macro-critical variables. In this, we critically need to rely and collaborate with our partner institutions for them to share with us the data and knowledge. But we want to make it very easy for our staff and later on for the authorities too, to access this kind of data. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And your call for the fast is great. They have been doing, your people have been doing a great job, but I think it's the governments. They have to start, the client countries, they have to start, and they have the data. So I think that your call should be, very visible out there, and countries should be submitting the data to the FAST because it's incredibly useful as a counterpart to the Findex. So Hana, we go, the World Bank has IDA, and IDA has been incredibly responsive. I think has been one of the most responsive mechanisms to mitigate the pandemic. Can you sort of talk a bit more about the sort of this IDA replenishment and the next one, and how can you assure that IDA will respond to gender equality concerns?
Wonderful. Mayra, in fact, first I would like to follow on what Ratna was talking about and give the perspective from the World Bank side. And also, I felt your earlier question, how to ensure that the financing actually is prioritizing the poor, and especially prioritizing women and girls who have been so negatively affected by the crisis is a very important one. So let me start with that, and then I'll come to IDA. So first, the one big part of investments within the World Bank has been into data. So here I'm following on what Ratna was saying, the importance of data, including a lot of surveys over the past years during the pandemic on high frequency phone surveys that have really advanced our understanding and helped make the case how women have been impacted. Women entrepreneurs, women-led businesses, women in terms of being at the risk of gender-based violence. So investing in data has been a critical part of the bank response. Soon we will be launching, in fact, gender data portal, which will be a tool available publicly to anyone to have access to all relevant sex disaggregated data, especially from the economic perspective. And this is an area where certainly there is a scope for further partnership and collaboration across institutions. Now, the data has helped inform the response by the World Bank Group, but also by government. So highlighting, for example, what are the constraints facing women as employees and as entrepreneurs, and highlighting the importance of childcare to actually address childcare in the future. Highlighted the importance of financial and economic and digital inclusion for women. So a lot of the response has been into social safety nets to support women, including women in the informal sector who have lost economic opportunities, support them with cash, deliver the cash through digital forms, so we're using mobile phones. Sometimes the mobile phones have been distributed to women. This way also bring women more into the financing sector, and to complement the cash with information, with coaching, with information that could come through the mobile phones or with the outreach through community workers, to provide women with information about what are the opportunities for rebuilding their livelihoods or for reintegrating into the labor force. So it's the cash transfers plus with emphasis on economic inclusion programs. And there are lots of examples which I'm happy to share if there is interest. Now, how to ensure that actually bank operations overall prioritize adequately women and girls. I would give you 3 examples. One is the World Bank Group gender strategy. The strategy is in place since 2016, is as relevant as ever. It puts emphasis on improving human endowments of women, important as ever, removing constraints to more and better jobs for women, remove barriers to women's ownership and control over assets, and in the context of the pandemic, extremely important also the need to enhance women's voice and agency, and in that context also to prevent gender-based violence, for example, as well as respond to. Now, that will then take me into the IDA. But before I go there, let me give you the second dimension, how the bank, in fact, is ensuring that gender equality is prioritized. Country partnership frameworks are an important tool. It's the strategy that frames World Bank Group's engagement at country level. And these country partnership frameworks are developed, in fact, in consultation with many stakeholders across also the civil society. A lot of civil society organizations contribute. And when you look at the so-called CPFs, and they are publicly available, you see that all of them pay attention to gender equality. Some do it very explicitly, having maybe 1 of 2 or 3 pillars specifically on closing gender gaps. Others do it as a kind of cross-cutting approach. Now, the third element that is influencing where financing and what the World Bank operations are doing is so-called the gender tag, the emphasis that is placed at the corporate level to ensure that operations make an intentional effort, an evidence-based effort to close specific gender gaps through operations. And in some regions, in fact, the regional vice president said, well, we want all operations to contribute to closing gender gaps. And we want all operations to meet the gender tag criteria. And this is evidence-based, and what it implies is that there is a strong analysis. There are very explicit actions that the projects would take to close gender gaps. There are also implementation arrangements, and there is a clear result chain, how the actions will translate to closing gender gaps. So now I'm going to respond to your question about IDA. As you know, IDA is an extremely important mechanism to provide concessional financing to low-income countries toward reducing poverty and promote economic development toward shared prosperity. Current IDA replenishment is having one of the core pillars is in fact on closing gender gaps. When you compare what is being proposed currently compared to last year and compared to years before, you see that there is again more ambition in terms of the numbers of countries, in terms of what countries would accomplish in specific areas. And there are also new so-called policy commitments. Specifically, there is more ambition to use IDA financing in collaboration with the recipient countries to develop productive economic inclusion programs, which I talked about a little bit. So now to develop it and implement it at scale, so as to support women to restore their livelihoods after the pandemic, and to promote their own entrepreneurship activities. There is increased emphasis on prevention and response to gender-based violence. So there is a specific target, how many countries, with the assistance of the World Bank through IDA operations, would develop national frameworks to launch system-wide approaches toward prevention, gender-based violence, for example, in health systems, in education systems. There is a new policy commitment on childcare for the World Bank through IDA to support countries in expanding access to affordable and quality childcare. And the interventions would include everything from improving regulatory framework policies, as well as investment into public and private provision of childcare. There is a strong policy commitment on improving access to financing for women and access to digital tools. And there is also a new commitment, in fact, an excellent opportunity to further strengthen the collaboration between IMF and the World Bank is around closing gender gaps through fiscal policy and budget systems. And this is new. This is building on a lot of investments into analytic tools on, for example, analyzing incidents of fiscal policies and how women are being affected, and how different reforms on the revenue side and on the expenditure side can in fact help promote gender equality. So these are some examples, but overall, and again, a lot of the information is public. You will see that through IDA, the ambition to use IDA financing to support countries toward closing gender gap is growing.
That's great.
Back to you, Mayra.
Great. And I think, particularly my colleagues at CGD must be delighted to hear about childcare that CGD has been pushing very much. And it's amazing, that finally there is, serious attempts to provide that kind of support to countries. But, but sort of countries are in the driver's seat in IDA. I mean, and more and more and more. I think it used to be, that these institutions, the IMF and the bank, were sort of dictating things. Well, now there's a lot more competition, there's funding, there are funds. So sort of there's, I think countries, and rightly so, are sovereign and are in the driver's seat. And it so happens, I think, unfortunately, that countries where the situation of women is the worst are the countries that, in fact, don't care to do these things, don't care to have actions, that will benefit women. What can you do there? I mean, how can the bank convince, reluctant governments to do things on behalf of women and girls?
This is a very important question, and this question, Mayra, takes me back to what Ratna and I have been talking about already during this conversation. Also, is the importance of data, importance of evidence. For the ministers of finance, for the governments, to see the evidence how gender inequality is detrimental for women, for the society, for the economy, for the next generation. What the evidence shows is making a clear case that investing in women, in girls, and in closing gender gap is, as we talk, it's smart economics. So having the evidence, not only at the global level as we have, but then in the context of every country, makes a huge difference. And I can give you, there are lots of examples, and I'm delighted that we have a lot of great examples. So one example that I would give you is Niger. Niger is a country with the highest fertility rate, and this reflects largely lack of choice for women and many other constraints. And there are a lot of inequalities for girls in terms of access to education, and then access to opportunities, the risks of child marriage. 3 out of 4 girls in Niger are married before the age of 18. Adolescent pregnancy is widespread. And of course, this has then negative consequences for further development of human capital for the girls and for their future economic, social, and life opportunities. So the World Bank has invested in a lot of analysis on what the cost of gender inequality is for Niger, and it has come up with some specific numbers in terms of maybe 1/5 of GDP could be increased relatively, or could be generated relatively quickly if some of the key gender gaps were closed. And with the details on the analysis, then that helped to influence the government, so that the government, in fact, decided that indeed it makes sense and it is aligned with the national priorities of the government to address some of the constraints that girls and women are facing. So in that context, then there has been a series of operations through which the World Bank is supporting the government in Niger, supporting specific legal actions to protect the girls, supporting specific investments, and also supporting partnerships with CSOs to kind of help change social norms, help influence the thinking of parents, also when it comes to providing the opportunities to their girls for developing their education and delaying marriage and pregnancy. So these are so the brief answer would be it's really the power of evidence. But I would add, and that's one area where the partnership with civil society organizations is so important, is also to influence the minds of fathers, of husbands, of future husbands. So really engaging also with at the community level with the traditional leaders, with the religious leaders, and influencing also through those channels.
Great. Social norms, big topic. Ratna, the same question to you, what you would do, how do you convince reluctant governments? With a couple of additional sort of questions that I have. Is leadership important? And do you think, at the IMF now is sort of a second generation of managing directors who are women, and not only are women, but are feminists and have been pushing for women's issues. Is that important? Does that help in any way? And so anyway, and then sort of another question also sort of in terms of civil society, but maybe we can get to that later. But Ratna, or yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mayra. Let me just say that leadership is absolutely critical at the IMF, at any place. So I think nothing will happen unless there is full commitment from the top. We've had 2 fantastic managing directors. Christine Lagarde led the way. We now have Kristalina, who's taking it to a whole new level. I cannot tell you how important it is to have leaders. They can be men or women. They don't have to be women to lead the way. And we as staff are very excited about that. Going back to your question about reluctant authorities, I agree 100% with Hana. The only way we are going to be able to do it is with solid empirical evidence. We can't simply rely on the advocacy approach. I think the advocacy approach helps a lot with the CSOs. They are absolutely fantastic. So they complement us. And of course, the other IFIs and MDBs also working together. We do have a group, the MDB group, and we are very united in working together on this topic. But coming back to the IMF precisely, we really need to back up our arguments with data and analysis. This has traditionally been our strength, and this is the only way for us to go. And on that, I should tell you that, in our own institution, we have a strategy, policy, and review department that they have been developing general equilibrium models which are suited for investigating, for example, the impact of a number of fiscal policies on gender employment, wage gaps, overall output, income distribution, consumption, savings, investment, name it, the fiscal deficit. This is not an easy job. And let me tell you why, because when we grew up, and even now, if you look at the universities, the courses on economics, the PhD courses that we took, they did not have models where we could look at different types of agents, so men and women. So we really have to adapt the models that we learned to look at these aspects and the policy outcomes, because it's important to provide granular advice and very country-specific advice. And so we are building, we have done it for a few countries, and we are very excited, absolutely, now that I hear Hana, to work with our colleagues across the street on these topics. Now, what do you do when they are skeptical? Apart from solid empirical evidence trying to convince them, the authorities may still not be ready. But I really think, and this is something I've learned over many years at the IMF, we just need to be patient and persistent. We raise the same issues again and again in our annual consultation cycle. This is not specific to gender. This concerns many topics. And it's so important that A, we be patient, and B, we be persistent. But we also don't want them to pay lip service. That doesn't help at all. And over the course of many years, we have learned ownership by the authorities is absolutely critical. Mayra, let me just end on this topic to tell you about my own personal experience, okay? I will not name the country, but I will tell you that many years ago, when I led a mission to a particular country, I was assigned to lead a mission to a country, and I was really excited because, for the first time we had an all-women's team, and I was the first woman mission chief with an all-women's team. The authorities, a few days before I was planning to go, actually told the IMF that we cannot accept a mission where the leader is a woman and she's not even white, and also a team which is all women. I know it sounds crazy, but this happened. And I have to tell you that our management, IMF management, was fully behind us. They said, if you want to go, go. We'll support you. If you don't want to go and you're uncomfortable, don't go. I took overnight to decide to go. And I tell you, it was one of my best missions. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it doesn't take time to change the minds of the authorities if you do a thorough job and give them really good analysis and argumentation.
Incredible example. Before we turn to Hana, I have a question for you, Ratna, and the question is, what is different about the fund's macro policy advice now? What shifts in emphasis to ensure fairness and inclusion?
So IMF has gone through, many existentialist crises over the years, decades, and you know that very well. And I have to say, I am so proud to be part of the IMF because we have responded, we have transformed ourselves. You can argue that sometimes we come in too late, but we more than make up for that once we get into it and once we are convinced. And we have seen this on many aspects of the work we do. One of which I also mentioned, which was the ownership of any lending programs that we have. Now it's so critical for us that the authorities are fully on board. So it's not IMF talking about, or dictating terms. That's gone, completely gone. I think on this issue of sensitizing ourselves and our member countries on issues that relate to the inclusion, inequality, gender, social safety nets. These are really critical and important discussions that happen now as part of a conversation now. Do we do deep dives on every topic? No, that is not true. I would exaggerate if I said we did that. But are we selective? I think we are selective, but we do need to cover more and more countries where all these issues, as I had explained earlier, are macro critical. Because we should not be stepping into other IFI's jobs. There's no need to duplicate the work. We can complement the work, but there's enough work for the IMF to do because there are gaps to be filled. So I think we are at, as Hana put it beautifully, at a turning point. At right now, many things that are happening, and I think we should take advantage of this opportunity. The COVID, no less, has also highlighted how huge the gaps are on the gender side, and also created opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, it has highlighted how bad things are for women and how worse they have become. So hopefully, as you say, it's however, an opportunity to do things differently. Hana, going back to you, and you've been talking about civil society and the importance of civil society, and it's music to my ears to hear about the IMF and the World Bank, but a lot of it's a very different talk from what people, particularly feminists, traditional feminists, thought of the bank and the IMF as not very friendly to women or to civil society. How would you respond to the criticisms about the bank and the fund and sort of policies that really were hurting women, and that sort of they were not listening to women, and that gender equality was not a priority? What would be your response, and how can these two institutions, I think, can also better dialogue with civil society? Hana, you first, and then Ratna.
Excellent question, Mayra. I would build on what Ratna said about the evolution of international finance institutions, including the World Bank Group. And to give you an example, policy lending. When you look at how policy lending is being used, you see that over the past 2-3 years, there has been enormous shift to use policy lending also to close gender gaps, to help governments address legal constraints facing women in accessing jobs, to expand childcare, to reduce gender-based violence. So a whole range of policy actions and reforms on policies and institutions that are being advanced through policy lending. So in fact, the last fiscal year, more than 2/3 of all policy-based operations have included specific actions on closing gender gaps. So this is a major shift. And we see similar shift also when it comes to human capital, investing in human capital, and in that context, also investing in the building and ability to utilize or the opportunities to utilize human capital for women. So that would as an illustration to my first part of response to your question is like to look at the evolution, look into what the World Bank Group is doing. You find for every project, for every operations, every report, everything you find online. And not only the project designs, but also implementation reports and reports about the results. And in fact, what we are now planning is, Mayra, next year, it is the 10th anniversary of the World Development Report on Gender Equality and Development. And we would like to take it as an opportunity to really have a kind of like a 10-year retrospective. What have we learned? What have we done? What countries have done? What has been accomplished? What lessons can we learn? What successes we can jointly with partners and importantly with countries, with communities? What successes we can be showcased? And then think also about the future. What the challenges are on the way. Thinking about the next 10 years and what the possible solutions might be. And this would be an important platform with lots of events, exchanges of ideas, so in which CSOs will be very much involved. And in fact, we are planning some events kind of focusing on effective partnerships with CSOs. And this platform then also will kind of help us jointly think about what our vision for the next 10 years should be, what the new strategy or action plan for the World Bank Group should be in further promoting gender equality. So this would be a nice platform to actually exchange ideas, experiences, and work together and position our collaboration with CSOs and more broadly for the future. Now, how CSOs specifically can engage. So what I just mentioned, it's kind of like the global level. But what is very important is the kind of the engagements and the collaboration at the country level and at the local level. And this is happening through several channels. I would highlight two. One is I talked about the country partnership framework, the priorities that the World Bank Group sets for itself in agreement with the government, how to support development and how to support the country governments in the development efforts. Having CSOs engaged in the consultations, and the consultations are extensive for every country partnership framework. So this is an important way to really influence how the World Bank Group, together with the government, see the priorities, bring in perhaps some evidence that the CSOs have from their own engagement and influence the overall strategy. The second channel for influencing and collaboration is through specific activities, such as operations. For every operation that the World Bank is developing in collaboration with the government, there is a consultation, and there are opportunities for CSOs to have a voice, share evidence, and in some cases, in fact, there are opportunities for CSOs to engage also in the implementation of the operations. And there are excellent examples, like from, for example, the Sahel countries, where the Sahel women empowerment and demographic dividend operations that have been scaled up in all these countries involve CSOs very much at the community level through very effective partnership, which kind of help to complement the efforts, the influencing and the engagement at the community level with the efforts at the policy and the institutional reform level.
Wonderful. I think you need to, the bank external relations needs to bring this up and publicize it more.
Well, thank you for these opportunities to tell you about it, and looking forward to more such opportunities.
Definitely. Ratna, I think we finished with your response to CSOs and feminism, just a short one, but it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Mayra. Engaging with the CSO, especially for us, which is a much smaller institution. We don't have that many people on the ground. It is absolutely invaluable. So it's not just about doing the right thing, but it's because we really have so much to learn from engaging with them to understand how we can serve. And it's not about serving governments, it's about serving the people in our member countries. The insights that they bring from the reality on the ground is precious. We of course engage with CSOs. I've done it also since taking on this job. But I will say that from our perspective, we need to engage more with them, perhaps before we formulate our policies and strategies. And a second thing I really want to point out is we also need to be much more upfront with them on what the IMF can or cannot do. Because sometimes we get requests which we don't have the mandate and there's not much we can do. And we should be very clear that, it is in some other IFI's mandate. So we should do both so that the expectations from them are also realistic, but they also hold us accountable. I think we can do a lot more. And in that context, one important development that I want to share with you is that, as I mentioned, we are latecomers in this game, but we are really stepping up. So I have been tasked with a fantastic team that I have to work on developing a comprehensive strategy on mainstreaming gender in the fund. And what is important is that this strategy is going to be presented to the board next year, early next year, in the first quarter of next year. That's our plan. And it is in the context of the strategy paper that I will also be collaborating with other IFIs, especially the World Bank. So we will be in touch because I would like to also explain in that strategy paper what are the complementarities and what is the gap that we are filling and how we can focus on macro-criticality. That is our core mandate. So thank you for that.
That's great, terrific news. And you have all of us help. We would be delighted to help.
Thank you.
In sort of helping putting together the strategy. And actually, the hour has gone by. I have 20 more questions to ask. So maybe we'll have a second conversation, but I really appreciate Ratna and Hana, your participation. Thank you so much for talking to us, and have a good evening and a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hana.
Thank you very much, Mayra. Thank you, Ratna. And looking forward to the conversations and collaboration in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.